Hi, I'm Jen Bernstein. Over the past few months, we've sat down with candidates for this November's election on The Real Story to help you make an informed decision. We're replaying those interviews here on Fox 61 Plus between now and Election Day. We'll have even more interviews, though, with more candidates here on The Real Story. And you can watch Sunday mornings on air on fox61.com and on Fox 61 Plus. Thanks for staying with us on The Real Story. We are talking about the race for Secretary of the State. Dominic Rapini, the Republican candidate for Secretary of the State, on your ballot in just over a few weeks. He grew up and lives in New Haven County and is a sales executive at Apple and an advocate for, he says, election integrity. His Democratic challenger, Stephanie Thomas, has been a staunch supporter of early voting and expanding absentee ballots. Dominic has a number of his own ideas for safer, more secure elections in Connecticut, and we thank Dominic so much for joining us right now to talk about them. Welcome.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for having me.
And you were on Real Story this summer before the primary challenge with Matt Caron, who is filling in. So welcome back.
Well, it's good to be back.
So, you know, for me, tell us about your background and why you want to run for this office.
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong Connecticut resident. You know, I grew up in Hamden, Connecticut, raised my family there. I was the first member of my family to go to college. When my family sent me, I went to Trinity College, and where I played my high school football, my college football and track, and I studied neuroscience there and had a great career. And since then, I've been everything from a science teacher to a small, medium, and large business owner, and a vice president in manufacturing, and then I joined Apple in 1997, right when Apple was on the brink. And I've been here for 26 years, and I've been Apple's salesperson here twice in the last 2 decades. And then for that entire time, you know, I've been immersed in my community. I've been a youth football coach in Pop Warner, New Haven for 32 years. And I've coached over 1,000 young men, and every day they energize me with their stories and their successes.
What is it about the Secretary of the State position that you felt a calling to?
Yeah, you know, so when I look at my background with all the 3 decades of technology work that I've done, and 3 decades of business, and then since 2019, I've been immersed in Connecticut elections. I rolled up my sleeve and done a lot of work to understand the voter rolls, became an election day moderator so I can understand the realities of working our elections. And, you know, when I look at this role, I'm like, this is like the most technologically demanding job in Hartford. So I have all the skill sets and all the experience that I can go in there, and, you know, I'll retire from Apple to do this job, and that's a sacrifice. It's been my dream job, but I'll do that because I do want to serve my state. And I've never had the opportunity to do that before, so this is a chance for me to get that done.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the platforms and things that you've also spoken about. And, you know, this is coming after a debate between you and Stephanie Thomas that happened this past week. So I know you explained some of your platforms on that, but talk to me about voter fraud in our state and election integrity. So you are pushing for election integrity. Tell me what that means exactly.
So election integrity is much more than just talking about fraud, right? It's really 3 things, right? It's the infrastructure of the technology that we need to run our elections, right? That's the first pillar. And our technology here has been neglected for over a decade. The hardware, the software, it's crumbling. It's on the edge of the abyss, and I'm sure they're trying to replace it, but it hasn't been done yet. We have election officials that just can't even do their job now because the software's down hours a day. So that's one pillar. The second thing is we need leadership and good communications coming out of the office. The Secretary of State's office, and I know there's good people there, but there's been all kinds of miscommunications and very limited guidance on election questions, and our election officials are frustrated with that. And the third thing is accountability, right? It's voter fraud. I mean, I don't want to make this all about voter fraud because I'm more concerned about the sloppiness that comes out of that office. But, you know, we have 5 cases of voter fraud in Connecticut right now. It's like a record year. It's just like we have a record year in crime and catalytic converters and all those things. For some reason, we have 4 federal investigations in 3 cities. We had an adjudication of a Democratic town chair in Stamford, 28 counts of voter fraud. And so what everyone needs to understand about me is I believe our elections have got to be safe, secure, and accessible. And if people are going to trust in our elections, we have to take those things seriously. And I just want to eliminate the root cause so we can focus on the other things that are important.
I mean, some of those cases are from years past too, right?
Well, they're all within the last year and a half, 2 years.
And I know your opponent had said during the debate that says, well, that's the system working. That shows that those cases were caught. What's your response to that?
Yeah, if the system was working, we would have no fraud. I mean, Stephanie Thomas believes that there's a certain level of acceptable fraud. You know, my response to her is, well, thank God you don't work in a bank, right? Because where else in our society do we, whether it's identity theft or our banking or our tax returns, do we accept fraud? It has to be zero tolerance. That has to be the goal. And just because I want people to trust our elections, and I don't want them to have to think about that, because we got to think about the technology and the other things we need to do. So that's a pretty clear position.
Yeah, I was watching that debate too, and she did say acceptable risk of fraud, but you could argue that, you know, what you feel about that. But she was basically saying that out of the 1.8 million votes cast, that there was a certain number, that it was a very small amount, what some would call, she says, an acceptable risk.
Well, let's look at it a different way. You know, all the election problems that I've recounted since 2019 all has to do with mail-in voting, right? But most importantly, it has to do with political campaigns. So the common denominator here is that candidates and political campaigns are abusing the absentee ballot system. And I love our system of absentee ballots, the way it's codified in our Constitution, and they're abusing it. And so when they're abusing it, whether it's on a small scale, large scale, it has a ramification throughout the community.
So explain that to me in terms of what are they doing with the absentee?
Well, so you have for example, a landlord in Bridgeport stole the identities of his tenants. Right, and that came off the voter rolls in Bridgeport that were not, properly maintained. He was able to grab them. He knew these people moved on, and he did absentee ballots in their name, right? So that's just one example of that where we have to make this work. There was a Republican in Stanford, a city clerk. I mean, you have to be extremely trustworthy, and this is rare because our city clerks they're amazing, right? Their attention to detail and their dedication is amazing. But this woman, she intercepted absentee ballots for her opponent, who's the current clerk, Lyda, who's a very good Democrat and town clerk, and she was replacing with ballots for herself. I mean, that's the fox watching the hen house. We can't have that.
I mean, in terms of that, how widespread do you think that is? Is that something that you feel like is common, or it's just something that you...
I don't know if it's widespread, because you only know about the ones that almost always requires a whistleblower to find these things out. And I don't think fraud is widespread. I don't think that's the point. I think what's more widespread is the kind of the sloppiness that comes out of Hartford, right? The guidance, the lack of technology oversight. There's a lot of other problems that are even more concerning. But we have to, it's not a binary choice. We have to do all these things to get it right.
I need to ask you about this. I know it sounds like you had talked about this with Matt Caron this summer, but it came up during the debate again. And so just for our viewers, Stephanie Thomas brought up tweets from you on January 6th where you were talking about the president's speech and the people there, and you did use the hashtag #StopTheSteal. And you're running for the chief election position here in the state. So give us your response to that. I mean, with the presidential election, who do you believe that Joe Biden won?
So I've said on this show, and I've said probably 100 times.
Sure.
After I asked a lot of questions about that election, because that's my right, and if not a moral responsibility of every voter, is to challenge elections, right? They should be challenging Stacey Abrams, Hillary Clinton, and the illegitimate presidency of Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, who has testified on C-SPAN about rigged elections. Listen, there's a lot of this stuff that's out there that I don't think any of it was good. But after I studied it and I asked the questions I needed to ask, I came to the conclusion, Joe Biden is our duly elected president. And I moved on from 2 years ago. Everything I've done now has been focused on Connecticut issues and the considerable questions. And I had hoped that Stephanie Thomas would ask more questions. She was the vice chair of the GAA committee, the election committee. She should have been asking questions about our tabulators, our software, and the fraud issues that she knew about and decided to be very, kind of keep her head in the sand on that. If she'd asked more questions, we'd probably have less problems today. So asking questions it's critical to our democracy to keep our republic strong.
Okay, so you're saying that you, after researching and looking into it, don't believe in what you were saying? You ask questions, you learn the answer, you say, okay, let's move on. We only have 2 minutes left, so I want to keep going.
Yes.
Tell me about early voting. So we're one of only 4 states in the country that doesn't have early voting. Are you for it or against it?
So I don't have a problem with early voting.
Sure.
I just have a problem with early voting in Connecticut. right? So Connecticut has a different infrastructure than those other states, right? For one thing, we have 169 unique towns. We don't have counties, right, which is a smaller number of precincts. So that means if you were to do 30 days of early voting, it would cost $15 to $20 million. The second thing is, we have one of the highest turnout rates throughout the United States, including those early voting states. So we have to ask ourselves, what problem are we solving? And third, and this is very important, most of our registered voters and our election officials are part-time. So imagine, you work 10 hours a week, and normally you're taking care of your grandchildren, or you work another full-time job, and all of a sudden you got to work 10, 20, 30 days in a row. It will be unable to perform that duty. And we're going to lose talent. And election resources and talent is really hard to come by. So I think we're going to create chaos with that group of people. And so I think for all those reasons together, say, you know what? We already have the system of absentee ballot voting, and let's just make that work. And if we have to expand it a little bit, if we can get political campaigns out of it, and we can make sure we have ID requirements for the requesters of ballots, I think we can make that more secure. But I think right now early voting is just not right for Connecticut, and I don't care what the other states do. Right? If you want to do that, nowhere in Europe do they have early voting. So we can look all over the place and find examples that meet our narrative, but Connecticut's what we need to solve for.
And you believe that we should be presenting a photo ID. Your opponent says, or identification when you go to the polls. Your opponent says that's just looking for a problem, because she says most people do present IDs, which you agreed with.
As a moderator, I see that all day long. They're doing it.
So why require it then, in your opinion?
So here's. Imagine this. Right now in Connecticut, you can vote with a Costco card. And I think our elections are more dignified than that. I think voters, in fact, 79% of all voters around the country, and my internal polling shows 74% here in Connecticut, want government ID. It's just common sense, because you think about it, you need government ID to do a lot of things, right? Driving a car, you want to get the really good Mucinex, at Walgreens, if you want to apply for a job. So let's talk about ways to help more citizens get IDs. And I would love to be able to create pop-up stores and retailers throughout the country in the month of October, and bring the idea opportunities to our voters.
To increase accessibility, because the issue is, of course, voter access, right?
It's access. And so I could set up a pop-up store like you see an H&R Block at a Walmart. And, we do a couple days a week, and that will help them get their ID, and we'll register them to vote at the same time. We can do two things at once. And I have a lot of experience in U.S. retail, so I know how to make these things work. And I think that's a solution, right, that I think everybody wants.
All right, Dominic Rapini, you are Republican candidate for Secretary of the State, and we are glad to have you back on The Real Story to explain your platform. Thank you so much.
Good.
Okay, and well, thanks for staying with us on The Real Story. We are sitting down with all the candidates of the state's biggest races with just a little over a week left until Election Day. Last week, we spoke to Dominic Rapini, the GOP nominee for Secretary of the State, and now we're sitting down with the other candidate, Democrat Stephanie Thomas, who says that the fight for democracy is personal and has focused her platform on expanding voting rights and restoring trust in our elections. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so tell us about your background and why you want to run for office. You're currently a state representative.
Correct, but I come from a business background and a nonprofit background. My entire career has been as a nonprofit fundraiser for 30 years, but while I was in graduate school getting my master's degree in nonprofit management, I ended up working for a for-profit consulting company, and I rose from intern to company president. I went on later to open my own business, working for nonprofits. I have been a state representative only since I took office in 2021, but I've had the pleasure of vice chairing our elections committee. And since I got politically involved, it occurred to me that there was a lot more we could do through the Secretary's office to teach people about how government works, and maybe more importantly, how they can make government work for them. So that is really part of the foundation of why I'm running.
Okay, so you want to increase education and awareness for elections in our state? How are you going to do that?
Sure. Civic education, but also civic engagement, and not just for young people, but for adults as well. I get so many queries, everything from how do I correctly fill out and submit my absentee ballot, and what's the difference between my state rep and my congressional rep. So the Secretary's office, I think we should have a YouTube channel, absolutely, that would demystify some of these processes and make it easy to understand. I will definitely be going out into the community to teach people through repetition in time, using trusted messengers, much like we did with the complete count committees with the census, just making sure people understand, one, how to vote safely, but also how to then, I call it, use your vote. I think living in this representative form of democracy requires our active participation beyond Election Day, and we can't just fill in that bubble and then abdicate our responsibility.
There's a lot of attention on this race, even more so than other years, because of the 2020 presidential election. When you're looking at the way we do elections here in Connecticut, what can we do better?
Sure. There are certainly things we can do better. There has been, I think, a bit of a false narrative out there about the need for strict voter ID. I have done a lot of research. The Heritage Foundation, for example, which is a very conservative think tank, I searched all of their records of election fraud in Connecticut, and there was literally not one case since 1988, and their records only go back that far, of any voter impersonation fraud. It is so rare. I think what we do need to focus on here in Connecticut, three things: making sure that our election workers have the infrastructure, hardware, software to do their job effectively, because sometimes mistakes happen. We have to train our election workers. Like every industry, we saw a lot of retirements. So we have a lot of new election workers. So we have to make sure that both they are trained up, but also all of the poll workers who only work on Election Day. And lastly, I think civic education and civic engagement. I'll say it once, I'll say it many times. We talk a lot about voter fraud, but I say there's a big difference between voter fraud and voter mistakes. And voters make a lot of mistakes because they are unaware of what is and isn't allowed. And I think that would actually help us cut down on any incidents we do have.
Your challenger, brought this up during the debate. Mm-hmm. You were talking about how you felt like there was an acceptable risk of fraud because of the amount of people who have voted. 1.8 million people, I think, is what you had said. Your opponent, even on the show when he came on, was saying that you were talking about how there was an acceptable fraud, is how he explained it. I had said acceptable risk, which is what you had said.
Correct.
But explain your position on that to people. Just clarify for us.
Sure. And we were talking about voter ID. There has always been fraud in every system created, I would say. I think on the debate he said something like, "I'm happy you don't work for a bank where they have zero fraud tolerance." That's not true. I'm sure you, like I, and everyone else I know has gotten, there's been a fraudulent attempt on your account. You just keep improving systems to cut down and minimize risk. So here in Connecticut, same thing, Heritage Foundation, if you look at all the cases of fraud over the last 10 years, under 40 cases, and 26 of those were the ones that were just adjudicated in Stamford. So very small percentage. On average, we're talking 0.0003. So if you have 40 cases in 10 years against 18 million votes, it's an acceptable risk, and whenever anything happens, you try to close that loophole. But as a leader, you have to understand that there will always be bad actors, and it's not limited to any particular political party. Some people just like to cheat systems. There's always that person who drives to the front of the column on the highway and cuts over at the last minute. Same with elections. So we just have to make sure we close as many loopholes as possible. possible.
We only have about 2 minutes left, but I do want to talk about early voting because it is on the ballot.
Yeah.
It would be a change to our Constitution. We're one of only 4 states who doesn't have early voting. Your opponent was bringing up concerns about the cost of doing early voting. He's not a supporter of it. Explain to me where you think, if you think Connecticut can handle whatever said cost is. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, his cost is predicated on the fact if we opened every single polling place and staffed it the way we do on Election Day. No states do that. Most states have what they call like a vote center model. It might be one office in a county, it might be a couple of locations, or it might be at town hall, which is usually open anyway. I feel confident there will be an added cost, so I will be fighting for a short window with the state, making sure we don't push that cost off to individual towns. But I feel like 46 other states have figured it out. All of the U.S. territories have figured it out. I think Connecticut is up to the challenge of figuring it out too.
One last message for voters.
Vote on November 8th. It's Election Day. I just want 100% participation. I really urge everyone to go out and vote, no matter who you vote for.
And we anticipate it's going to be high, right? Because we have so many offices. I mean, we have U.S. Senate, we have all the Constitution offices, the legislature, we have our congressional offices all up. So a lot of people will be on the ballot, and hopefully a lot of people go out and vote on November 8th, Tuesday. Wow, it's coming up quick.
Yes.
All right, Stephanie Thomas, thank you so much for coming on. Candidate for Secretary of the State. Thanks so much for watching. Remember, you can find more candidate interviews here on Fox 61+. Join us election night for full coverage of all the state races.